The Blackwood did not welcome the living. It was a suffocating, shadow-drenched expanse of ancient, twisting trees that seemed to actively bleed the warmth from the air. The canopy was so thick that the midday sun was reduced to a sickly, pale twilight, and the silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the heavy, agonizing rasp of Ronan's own breathing. Every step the warrior took felt like walking through broken glass. Ronan, once the most lethal and feared executioner of the Ironwood Pack, was a dying man. Beneath his heavy leather armor and the dark, fur-lined cloak that marked his rank, his powerful body was a roadmap of chronic, excruciating agony. Thick, jagged black veins crawled up his neck and spiderwebbed across his broad chest, a physical manifestation of the lingering silver poisoning that had been slowly eating him alive for 5 years. It was the same poison that had coated the blades of the shadow beasts who had slaughtered his family in the dead of night. His mate, his pup, his entire bloodline, erased in a single, brutal massacre. The forest which sent them, Alpha Garrick had told him, standing over the fresh graves of Ronan's family, his hand resting heavily on the broken warrior's shoulder. She cursed our borders, Ronan. She despises the wolves. Her dark magic blights our lands, and she used her shadow beast to strike at the very heart of my greatest warrior. We cannot breach her wards by force, but there is an older law, a law even she cannot deny. The ancient marriage pact. It was a suicide mission, but Ronan was already a ghost. He had journeyed into the heart of the cursed Blackwood with a single, burning vow of vengeance etched into his rotting soul, and a heavy, silver-forged dagger hidden deep within his boot. The plan was terrifyingly simple. Offer himself to the feared forest witch as a husband, bind his blood to hers to legally bypass the impenetrable, lethal magical wards that protected her grove, and the moment she dropped her guard, plunged the silver blade directly into her dark heart. He didn't care if the magic of the woods tore him apart a second later. His life had ended 5 years ago. This was merely the violent epilogue. After 3 grueling days of navigating the twisting, hallucination-inducing fog of the outer woods, the trees finally parted. Ronan stumbled into a small, overgrown clearing. In the dead center, built directly into the colossal, gnarled roots of an ancient, dying oak tree, was the cabin. It did not look like a fortress of malice. It looked like a natural extension of the earth, covered in thick green moss and hanging vines. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, smelling faintly of burning pine and dried sage. Ronan stopped at the edge of the clearing. He could feel the wards, a heavy, invisible wall of crushing atmospheric pressure that made the hair on his arms stand up. If he took one hostile step forward, the forest would turn him inside out. He dropped to one knee in the damp earth, fighting a wave of blinding pain as the silver in his blood violently flared. "I am Ronan of the Ironwood," he gritted out, his hoarse voice echoing in the unnerving silence of the grove. "I come unarmed. I come empty. I offer my blood, my breath, and my bone to the guardian of the Blackwood. I invoke the right of the hearth." The silence stretched for a long, agonizing minute. The shadows around the cabin seemed to deepen, swirling and coalescing into a physical weight. Then, the heavy oak door slowly creaked open. Ronan braced himself, expecting a withered, horrifying hag dripping with rot and dark magic. Instead, the breath hitched painfully in his failing lungs. Sable stepped out onto the moss-covered porch. She was not a monster. She was an ethereal, imposing creature of the earth. Her long hair was the color of spun shadows, falling wildly over her shoulders, and her eyes were a piercing, unreadable shade of crushed moss. She wore a simple, functional dress of woven dark wool, her bare feet touching the cold dirt without hesitation. She did not radiate malice. She radiated an eerie, detached, and absolute calm. She looked down at the heavily scarred, dying wolf kneeling at the edge of her wards. She did not ask why an Ironwood executioner was offering himself to the witch his pact despised. She did not question the sudden, desperate proposal. "The woods demand a life for a life, Wolf," Sable said, her voice a soft, melodic rustle of autumn leaves that carried effortlessly across the clearing. You offer yourself to the shadow. Once the blood is bound, you cannot leave. The earth will claim you. Let it claim me, Ronan answered, his voice a low, gravelly growl of pure, hidden hatred. Sable stepped off the porch. She walked directly through the invisible wards without breaking stride, stopping inches from the kneeling warrior. She drew a small, curved bone knife from her belt. Without a word of ceremony, she sliced a shallow, clean line across the palm of her left hand. She held the knife out to him. Ronan took the blade. He sliced his own palm, his blood mixing with the black, poison veins. He reached up, pressing his bleeding palm directly against hers. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. A shockwave of pure, ancient earth magic exploded from their joined hands. Ronan gasped as the invisible, crushing wall of the wards instantly vanished around him. The forest recognized the blood tie. He was no longer an intruder. He was the husband of the grove. The air suddenly filled with the scent of blooming nightshade and damp soil. Sable pulled her hand away, the cut on her palm already beginning to knit itself back together. She looked at him with those deep, unreadable green eyes. "Enter the hearth, husband," she murmured, turning her back on the lethal assassin and walking slowly back toward the cabin. Ronan stood up, his hand hovering over the boot where his silver dagger was hidden. "I am in," he thought, a dark, vicious satisfaction warring with the agonizing pain in his chest. "I will wait for the sun to set. I will wait for her to sleep. And then I will burn her world to ash." He followed the witch into the gloom. The interior of the cabin was surprisingly warm. It was small, dominated by a massive stone hearth where a heavy iron cauldron bubbled furiously over an open flame. Bundles of dried, unidentifiable herbs hung from the wooden rafters, casting strange, spindly shadows across the floorboards. There were no skulls, no blood-soaked altars, no demonic tomes. Just the overwhelming, rich scent of a brewing meal. Sable did not speak to him. She pointed to a heavy wooden chair at a small, scarred dining table. Ronan sat down heavily, his muscles screaming in protest. The silver poisoning was aggressive today, sending sharp, stabbing spikes of cold agony directly into his heart. He discreetly shifted his right leg, ensuring the hilt of his hidden dagger was easily accessible. Sable moved around the kitchen with a quiet, practiced grace. She took a wooden bowl from a shelf, filled it generously from the bubbling iron cauldron, and placed it on the table directly in front of him. She set a carved wooden spoon beside it, then retreated to the opposite side of the room, sitting by the hearth and watching him in absolute silence. Ronan stared down at the bowl. It was a dark, earthy stew, thick with root vegetables, chunks of roasted meat, and a broth that shimmered with a faint, unnatural golden hue. His tactical mind immediately went into overdrive. "This is it," he thought, his jaw locking. "This is how the forest which breaks the minds of men. It is laced with nightshade. It is a slow-acting paralytic. It is a mind-altering fungus designed to strip my free will and turn me into a mindless thrall of the woods." He looked up at Sable. She simply gestured to the bowl, her expression completely blank. Ronan's fingers twitched toward his boot. He could draw the blade now. He could leap across the table and end it before she could cast a hex. But he was weak. His body was failing, his vision slightly blurred from the pain in his chest. If he missed the killing blow, she would tear him apart. He needed to maintain the ruse. He needed to prove he was a compliant, broken sacrifice, waiting for the perfect, defenseless moment in the dead of night. Besides, he reasoned darkly, his blood was already saturated with lethal silver. What difference did a little witch's poison make to a corpse? Ronan picked up the wooden spoon. He scooped up a generous portion of the dark broth and the meat, locked eyes with the monster who had murdered his family, and forced the food into his mouth. He braced for the bitter taste of ash, the sickening burn of acid, or the numb, creeping cold of rot. Instead, an explosion of rich, savory warmth flooded his senses. The stew tasted of slow-roasted marrow, spiced root garlic, and a deeply satisfying, complex earthiness that instantly made his mouth water. It was, without a doubt, the most incredible thing he had ever tasted in his miserable life. But it was not the flavor that caused Ronan to drop the wooden spoon onto the table with a loud clatter. The moment he swallowed, a physical shockwave hit his stomach. It wasn't pain. It was a blinding, undeniable wave of pure, concentrated vitality. Ronan gasped, his hands gripping the edges of the wooden table so hard his knuckles turned white. The chronic, agonizing burning in his chest, a pain he had lived with every single second for 5 years, suddenly, violently cooled. It felt like someone had poured a pitcher of pure, glacial spring water directly over his inflamed heart. He looked down at his trembling hands. The thick, jagged black veins of silver poisoning that crept across his knuckles were actively receding. It was only a fraction of an inch, but he saw it. The dark, necrotic tint to his skin was fading, replaced by a flush of healthy, oxygen-rich blood. The suffocating tightness in his lungs evaporated. For the first time in half a decade, Ronan drew a full, deep, painless breath. He stared at the wooden bowl of stew in absolute, mind-breaking horror. It wasn't poison. It wasn't rot. It was pure, unfiltered, ancient restoration. The meal was actively, aggressively healing the fatal wounds that the healers of the Ironwood Pack had sworn were permanently incurable. Ronan looked up at Sable, the forest which was still sitting by the hearth, her green eyes watching him with that same eerie, detached calm. A cold, frantic paranoia seized the executioner's brain. His vow of vengeance violently clashed with the impossible, physical reality occurring within his own flesh. "It's a trick," Ronan's mind screamed, his hand instinctively dropping to the hilt of the silver dagger hidden in his boot. "It has to be a trick. She is mocking me. She is fattening the calf for the slaughter. She is lowering my defenses before she eats my soul." But as he sat in the shadowy cabin, his heart beating strong and steady for the first time in years, the hardened warrior realized with terrifying certainty that drawing a blade against the woman whose magic was actively saving his life was going to be infinitely more complicated than he had ever imagined. The passage of time within the suffocating boundaries of the Blackwood was not measured by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the steady, rhythmic bubbling of the iron cauldron in the hearth. For 3 weeks, Ronan lived in a state of suspended, agonizing paranoia. Every morning, he woke on a simple woven pallet near the fire, his hand instinctively dropping to the top of his boot to ensure his silver-forged dagger was still hidden. And every morning, he found Sable already awake, her back to him, stirring a new concoction over the flames. She served him in silence, spiced root teas that smelled of morning dew and crushed pine needles. Thick, hearty porridges infused with wild mountain honey and glowing, golden berries. Slow-roasted venison glazed in a dark, earthy mushroom reduction that melted on the tongue. With every single bite the warrior swallowed, his body waged a violent, miraculous war of resurrection. The physical transformation was undeniable and terrifying. The thick, jagged black veins that had mapped his chest and throat for 5 years slowly began to fade, retreating day by day until his skin was entirely clear. The deep, chronic ache in his bones, the agonizing legacy of the silver poisoning that had crippled his strength, evaporated entirely. He could feel his torn muscle fibers knitting back together, rebuilding themselves thicker, denser, and infinitely more powerful than they had been before the massacre. He was sleeping deeply, without the suffocating night terrors of his family's slaughter. His senses sharpened to a lethal, razor-like edge. He felt oxygen flooding his lungs with a cool, pristine clarity he hadn't experienced since he was a young pup in the Ironwood training rings. He was becoming a god of war, fueled by the culinary magic of the monster he had sworn to kill. The cognitive dissonance was slowly driving him mad. Ronan spent his days sitting on the moss-covered porch, carving pieces of dead wood with a hunting knife, waiting for the trick to reveal itself. He waited for the sudden paralysis. He waited to feel the cold, creeping sensation of mind control overriding his free will. He waited for Sable to demand a blood sacrifice, or to command him to march back to the Ironwood Pack as her enthralled puppet. but the forest witch asked absolutely nothing of him. She did not pry into his past. She did not gloat about the impenetrable wards that kept her safe. She barely spoke to him at all. She simply cooked her glowing, miraculous meals, set them before him, and watched with those sad, ancient green eyes as he scraped the wooden bowls clean. It was on the 21st day that Ronan's fragile, misdirected hatred finally began to crack. He woke long before dawn, the cabin cloaked in deep shadow. He immediately noticed the hearth was cold, and the heavy oak door was slightly ajar. Sable was gone. Ronan's tactical instincts flared. This was it. The witch was dropping the facade. She was out in the darkness, performing her dark rites, conjuring the shadow beasts to terrorize the borders of his pack. He slipped his silver dagger from his boot, the cool metal feeling heavy and reassuring in his grip. He stepped out of the cabin, melting seamlessly into the shadows of the twisted trees. His restored ironwood stealth was flawless. He moved through the dense underbrush without snapping a single twig or disturbing a single leaf. He tracked her scent, a mixture of damp earth, blooming nightshade, and an underlying note of profound exhaustion. He followed her for 2 miles, moving deeper toward the eastern edge of the Blackwood. The deeper they went, the more the atmosphere changed. The rich, vibrant green moss gave way to a sickening, brittle gray. The ancient trees here were not thriving, they were weeping. A thick, foul, black sludge seeped from their bark, pooling in the roots and choking the life out of the soil. The air smelled foul, carrying a suffocating, metallic stench that made the hair on the back of Ronan's neck stand up. He slipped behind the trunk of a massive, dying oak, peering through the gloom. Sable was standing in the center of a heavily blighted clearing. She looked incredibly small against the backdrop of the dying forest. She did not have a blood altar. She was not chanting curses into the wind. Instead, the feared forest witch dropped to her knees in the corrupted, black mud. She pressed her bare hands directly into the foul, weeping sludge at the base of the nearest tree. Ronan watched, his breath catching in his throat, as she closed her eyes and began to hum a low, desperately sad melody. The earth responded. A faint, pure green light began to pulse from her palms. But the magic was not a weapon. It was a filter. Ronan watched in absolute horror as the thick, black sludge actively crawled up Sable's pale arms, sinking directly into her skin. She was drawing the rot out of the forest and pulling it into her own body. She gasped, her face contorting in immense, agonizing pain as the blight entered her veins. The green light from her hands flared, violently combating the darkness within her, purging the poison from the earth by using her own life force as the crucible. She knelt there for an hour, trembling violently, bleeding her own vitality into the soil until the black sludge at the base of the tree finally dried up, replaced by a fresh, vibrant patch of green moss. Sable collapsed forward, her breathing ragged and shallow, coughing weakly into the dirt. Ronan remained frozen behind the oak tree, his mind reeling. The entire narrative of his existence was being systematically dismantled. Alpha Garrick had told the pack that the forest which was blighting the lands, that her malice was spreading a dark curse toward their borders to starve the wolves. But Ronan was an elite warrior. He knew the scent of war. He inhaled deeply, analyzing the foul metallic stench that lingered in the blighted clearing. It didn't smell like dark magic or witchcraft. It smelled of sulfur, refined silver ash, and concentrated wolfsbane. It was industrial runoff. It was the exact, undeniable chemical signature of the massive, hidden alchemy forges that Alpha Garrick used to arm his elite guards. The geographical reality hit Ronan like a physical blow to the jaw. This clearing was on the far eastern edge of the Blackwood. It was directly downhill from the Ironwood Pack's primary armory. The witch wasn't attacking them. She was defending herself. The rot wasn't her curse. It was the toxic waste of Garrick's war machine, deliberately being pumped directly into the Blackwood to kill the forest from the inside out. And Sable was slowly, agonizingly killing herself to hold the line. She was absorbing the poison of the wolves to keep her home alive, dragging herself back to the cabin every morning, completely exhausted, only to pour whatever scraps of magic she had left into healing the broken assassin who had been sent to murder her. Ronan looked down at the silver dagger trembling in his hand. The weapon felt like a lead weight. The hatred that had fueled him for 5 long years suddenly felt hollow, misdirected, and entirely sickening. He had walked into the woods ready to execute a monster, only to discover that the monster was the one sitting on the ironwood throne. He sheathed the dagger. The metallic click seemed deafening in the quiet clearing. Sable heard it. She weakly pushed herself up onto her elbows, her moss-green eyes wide with sudden fear as the massive, heavily scarred warrior stepped out from the shadows. She looked at his face, expecting to see the cold, unyielding wrath of an executioner ready to end her life, while she was entirely drained of magic. Ronan walked toward her. He didn't move with the predatory stalk of a wolf. He moved with the heavy, solemn stride of a man whose entire world had just shifted on its axis. He stopped directly over her, casting a long, protective shadow across her exhausted frame. Sable braced herself, squeezing her eyes shut, accepting that the end had finally come. Instead of a blade, she felt 2 massive, calloused hands gently slide beneath her arms. Ronan lifted the forest witch from the poisoned dirt. He handled her with an exquisite, terrifying gentleness, as if she were made of spun glass. He easily scooped her up into his broad chest, cradling her against the heavy leather armor of the pack that was trying to destroy her. Sable looked up at him, utterly bewildered, her hands resting weakly against his chest. She could feel his heart beating, strong, steady, and entirely free of the silver poisoning that had been killing him 3 weeks ago. "Why?" Sable whispered, her voice barely a thread. You have your opening. Your blade is sharp. The wards will not stop you now." Ronan looked down into her eyes. The mask of the cold, dead executioner was entirely gone, replaced by a fierce, burning storm of absolute loyalty and impending violence. He had spent his entire life fighting for a pact that lied to him, a pact that had likely slaughtered his own family just to manufacture a reason for this war. He was done being a weapon for tyrants. "My blade is sharp," Ronan replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through his chest, carrying a dark, unbreakable vow. "But it is no longer pointing at you. Save your strength, little witch. The ironwood owes you a blood debt, and I am going to collect it for you." He turned his back on the blighted border and carried his wife home, completely unaware that miles away, the true architect of his misery was already marching toward the Blackwood, ready to spring the final trap. The journey back to the heart of the Blackwood felt entirely different than Ronan's agonizing trek 3 weeks prior. He did not stumble. He did not gasp for breath. He moved with the terrifying, silent grace of a fully restored apex predator, his massive chest rising and falling in smooth, powerful rhythms. In his arms, Sable felt impossibly light, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the toxic rot she had absorbed to save the trees. He carried her into the dimly lit cabin and gently laid her down on the woven pallet near the hearth. For the first time since he had arrived, it was the executioner who tended the fire. He threw fresh logs onto the embers, coaxing a warm, crackling blaze to life, before retrieving a heavy wool blanket and draping it carefully over her shivering shoulders. He poured a cup of clean water from a clay pitcher and held it to her pale lips. Sable drank weakly, her eyes fluttering open to look up at the towering, heavily scarred warrior kneeling beside her. Ronan set the cup aside. He looked at his own hands, massive, lethal instruments of violence that were now completely clear of the black, necrotic veins that had plagued him for 5 years. He was whole. He was stronger than he had been in his prime. And it was all because the woman lying in front of him had chosen to bleed her magic into his meals instead of letting him rot. "You knew," Ronan said, his voice a low, heavy rumble that filled the quiet cabin. It wasn't an accusation. It was an absolute certainty. "You knew exactly why I came to the grove. You felt the silver dagger in my boot. You knew I was an assassin sent by the Ironwood." Sable rested her head back against the pallet, her moss-green eyes filled with a profound, ancient sadness. She did not look away from him. The forest feels everything, Ronan, she whispered, her voice weak but steady. When you knelt at the edge of my wards, I did not just hear your vow. I heard the heartbeat of a man who was already dead. I felt the cold, jagged edge of your hatred. I knew you intended to plunge that blade into my chest the moment I closed my eyes. Ronan's jaw clenched, a muscle feathering in his cheek. The shame that washed over him was bitter and suffocating. Then why? He demanded, leaning closer, his brow furrowed in desperate confusion. Why let me in? Why accept the marriage pact? Why spend 3 weeks pouring your precious, fading magic into the veins of a wolf who wanted to murder you? Sable reached out, her pale, trembling fingers gently brushing the rough leather of his armor. Because I also felt the poison in your blood, Sable answered softly. I felt the agony you carried, and I recognized the toxin. You came here believing I was the monster who destroyed your life, Ronan. But the Blackwood does not command shadow beasts. My magic is of the earth, of roots and green light. It gives life, it does not take it. She took a slow, agonizing breath, preparing to deliver the blow that would shatter his world completely. The silver poisoning that was eating your heart. Sable continued, her gaze locking onto his. It is not a witch's curse. It is a highly refined alchemical toxin. There is only one forge in these territories capable of producing a poison that aggressive, that purely metallic. Ronan froze. The air in the cabin seemed to turn to ice. His tactical mind, sharpened by years of warfare, immediately completed the horrific equation before she even spoke the words. Alpha Garrick's elite guard, Ronan whispered, the realization tasting like ash in his mouth. Sable nodded slowly. Your family's land bordered the most resource-rich sector of the Blackwood, she explained, her voice thick with sorrow for his loss. Garrick has wanted to log these woods and harvest the magical ley lines for decades, but the other pacts refused to break the ancient treaties without cause. He needed a martyr. He needed a tragedy horrific enough to rally the northern wolves to war. So, he sent his own elite guards into your home in the dead of night. He slaughtered your mate and your pup, poisoned you, and blamed the forest witch. The revelation hit Ronan with the concussive force of a falling dreadnought. The grief he had buried for 5 years violently resurrected itself, instantly transmuting into a blinding, apocalyptic rage. His hands curled into massive fists, the leather of his gloves groaning under the strain. His entire existence, his suffering, his desire for vengeance, it had all been a meticulously crafted lie. Alpha Garrick had stood over the graves of Ronan's family, weeping false tears, while his own hands were drenched in their blood. Garrick had turned Ronan into a rabid, dying dog and pointed him at an innocent healer, using his grief as a weapon. Ronan stood up, his massive frame practically vibrating with lethal, unrestrained fury. The restored muscles in his back and shoulders coiled like heavy steel springs. He was going to march back to the Ironwood stronghold. He was going to tear the heavy iron doors off the throne room, rip Garrick's head from his shoulders, and mount it on the stronghold walls. I will kill him, Ronan growled, his voice dropping into a demonic, feral frequency that made the flames in the hearth flicker. I will strip the flesh from his bones. I will make him choke on his own. A deafening, catastrophic sound ripped through the Blackwood, instantly cutting off Ronan's vow. It sounded like a massive sheet of thick glass shattering across the sky. The earth beneath the cabin violently shuddered, shaking dust from the wooden rafters and causing the iron cauldron to rattle against its hook. The sudden, terrifying shift in the atmospheric pressure was instantaneous. The heavy, protective weight of the magical wards that had surrounded the clearing for centuries completely vanished. Sable gasped, sitting up abruptly on the pallet, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated panic. The wards, she choked out, grabbing Ronan's forearm with surprising strength. They're gone. The boundary has fallen. Ronan's combat instincts instantly took over. He spun toward the heavy oak door, drawing the silver-forged dagger from his boot in a blur of motion. His senses extended into the darkness outside the cabin. The pristine, earthy scent of the Blackwood was gone. In its place, the night air was flooded with the foul, unmistakable stench of wet fur, oiled steel, and concentrated wolfsbane. How? Ronan demanded, his eyes scanning the gaps in the window shutters. How could he break the wards? An entire army couldn't breach that magic. Sable looked at the shallow, healed scar on the palm of her hand where she had bound her blood to his. A look of horrifying realization washed over her pale face. He didn't break them from the outside, Sable whispered, the devastating truth dawning on her. He used a backdoor. The marriage pact. I bound my blood to yours, Ronan, welcoming you into the heart of the grove. But you are sworn by a blood oath to the Ironwood Alpha. Garrick didn't send you here just to assassinate me. He sent you here to act as a living anchor. Once the earth recognized you as my husband, Garrick used your blood tie to the pact to walk right through the defenses. Before Ronan could fully process the depth of Garrick's twisted, manipulative genius, the heavy oak door of the cabin was violently kicked open. The wooden door ripped off its iron hinges, crashing to the floorboards. Through the threshold stepped Alpha Garrick. He was a massive, imposing wolf, heavily armored in black steel and draped in the thick, silver-tipped pelts of his station. His eyes gleamed with a cold, arrogant triumph. Behind him, spilling into the clearing like a tide of shadow, were 12 elite Ironwood guards. They were fully shifted into their towering, bipedal wolf forms, their jaws dripping with saliva, clutching heavy broadswords coated in the very same silver toxin that had nearly killed Ronan. Garrick stepped into the warm light of the cabin, a sickening, predatory smile twisting his scarred face. He looked at the shattered door, then at the exhausted witch trembling on the pallet, and finally, his gaze settled on his executioner. Garrick hadn't expected Ronan to survive the silver poisoning this long. He had assumed the warrior would die shortly after killing the witch, tying up the final loose end. But seeing Ronan standing over the woman, dagger in hand, Garrick misread the scene entirely. Good dog, Alpha Garrick sneered, his voice dripping with condescending approval. He stepped further into the room, gesturing to the heavy silver broadswords of his elite guard. I knew I could count on my finest executioner. You opened the door beautifully, Ronan. I see you haven't finished the job yet, but no matter. The wards are down. The Blackwood is ours for the taking. Garrick drew his own blade, the metal scraping menacingly against its sheath. He pointed the tip directly at Sable's chest. Step aside, Ronan, Garrick commanded, the absolute authority of the Alpha ringing in his voice. You have served your purpose. Bleed the witch, and let us claim the magic of the woods for the Ironwood. Ronan stood perfectly still. The silence in the cabin was deafening, save for the low, guttural growls of the elite guards waiting outside. Garrick had walked into the cabin expecting to find the broken, dying puppet he had created. He expected the grieving widower, blinded by a manufactured hatred, eager to strike down the monster who had supposedly ruined his life. But as Ronan slowly turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto the Alpha who had slaughtered his family, Garrick felt a sudden, icy sliver of genuine terror pierce his arrogant heart. The man standing between the Alpha and the witch was not broken. He was not dying. He was a fully restored, divinely healed god of war, radiating an apocalyptic, lethal fury that dwarfed the presence of the entire strike team combined. Ronan tightened his grip on the silver-forged dagger, the blade he had intended for the forest which was about to find its true, deserving home. Alpha Garrick's sickening, predatory smile faltered, replaced by a deep, instinctual unease. The executioner did not step aside. The broken, dying puppet Garrick had sent into the woods was entirely gone. In his place stood a towering monolith of cored muscle and suppressed, apocalyptic violence. Ronan reached up with his left hand and gripped the heavy, forged iron insignia of the Ironwood Pack that was bolted to the center of his chest plate. With a violent, effortless yank, he tore the metal sigil from his armor, snapping the thick leather straps. He tossed the heavy iron plate to the floorboards. It landed at Garrick's feet with a dull, resonant thud. My family, Ronan rumbled, the words vibrating with a lethal, demonic frequency that caused the hanging herbs in the rafters to tremble. My mate, my pup, you stood over their graves and told me the shadows took them. You filled my veins with your silver rod and aimed me at a healer. Garrick took a slow, calculated step backward, his eyes darting to the clear, healthy skin of Ronan's neck and arms. The black, necrotic veins were completely gone. The warrior's chest expanded with deep, powerful breaths, entirely free of the agonizing rattle that had plagued him for 5 years. The realization hit the Alpha like a physical blow. The forest which hadn't just survived the assassin, she had cured him. She had rebuilt the Ironwood's most dangerous executioner into an unstoppable force, and now, that force was standing between Garrick and his prize. You are a traitor to your blood, Ronan. Garrick roared, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. He pointed his broadsword toward the center of the cabin. Kill him, tear the traitor to pieces, and bring me the witch's head. The 12 elite guards surged forward, their massive, bipedal wolf forms crowding the shattered doorway. They moved with terrifying speed, their jaws snapping and their silver-coated broadswords raised for the slaughter. But they were attacking a man who had been reforged by the earth itself. Ronan did not brace for the impact. He met the charge. He moved with a blinding, impossible velocity that defied his massive size. He slipped effortlessly beneath the wide, clumsy arc of the first guard's broadsword, stepping directly into the creature's guard. With a brutal, fluid upward thrust, Ronan drove his silver-forged dagger deep into the soft, unarmored flesh beneath the massive wolf's jaw. The guard crumpled instantly. Before the massive body could hit the floorboards, Ronan ripped the heavy silver broadsword from its dying grip. Now armed with the dagger in his left hand and the massive broadsword in his right, the executioner became a whirlwind of unadulterated, apocalyptic violence. The tight confines of the small cabin instantly turned the guards' numbers against them. They could only attack 2 at a time, funneling directly into the meat grinder of Ronan's restored strength. A second guard lunged, jaws snapping toward Ronan's throat. Ronan brought the heavy broadsword around in a devastating horizontal arc, cleaving cleanly through the beast's dark armor and sending it crashing into the stone hearth. A third guard swung for Ronan's legs, but the warrior leaped backward with supernatural agility, landing lightly on the wooden table before launching himself through the air, driving both knees into the chest of a fourth guard and burying his dagger in its heart as they crashed onto the porch. Blood splattered against the moss-covered walls. The deafening sounds of shattering bone, clashing steel, and feral, agonizing howls shattered the ancient silence of the Blackwood. Ronan fought like a demon unchained. His muscles, nourished by the glowing, magical stews of the forest which did not tire. His lungs drew in massive amounts of oxygen without a hint of pain. He was a perfect, lethal instrument, and for the first time in 5 years, his wrath was finally pointed at the monsters who actually deserved it. Garrick watched his elite strike team being systematically dismantled in absolute horror. 6 of his best warriors were already dead, their blood pooling on the floorboards. Enough, Garrick bellowed, his voice echoing with the crushing, magical resonance of the Alpha command. The Alpha violently shifted. The human tyrant was swallowed by a colossal, nightmare-inducing beast of black steel and matted fur. Garrick in his alpha wolf form was a terrifying sight, a massive, heavily scarred predator that radiated dominance and fear. He shoved his remaining, terrified guards aside and lunged directly into the cabin, his massive jaws opening to snap Ronan in half. Ronan dropped the stolen broadsword and stood his ground. As the colossal alpha closed the distance, Garrick unleashed a sustained, deafening roar infused with the magical submission frequency of the pack hierarchy. It was a mental and physical shockwave designed to force any subordinate wolf to instantly drop to their knees and bare their throat. The shockwave hit Ronan squarely in the chest, but the warrior did not kneel. He did not bow. "I do not answer to the pack," Ronan roared back, his own voice harmonizing with the ancient, unyielding power of the earth beneath his feet. I answered to the grove. Because of the marriage pact, Ronan's blood was no longer solely tied to the Ironwood. He was bound to the forest which, anchored to the deep, impenetrable magic of the Blackwood. The Alpha command washed over him uselessly, shattering against the invisible shield of Sable's life force running through his veins. Garrick's glowing red eyes widened in sheer panic as his ultimate weapon failed. Ronan ducked beneath the Alpha's massive, snapping jaws. He drove his left shoulder directly into Garrick's chest with the force of a battering ram, knocking the colossal beast off balance. As Garrick stumbled backward, his heavy claws tearing gouges into the wooden floor, Ronan stepped inside the predator's reach. He didn't use the broadsword. He used the very weapon Garrick had commanded him to carry. With a feral, guttural cry of absolute vindication, Ronan drove the silver-forged dagger directly into the center of the massive Alpha's chest, plunging it deep into his corrupt heart. Garrick let out a high-pitched, agonizing shriek as the pure silver bit into his vital organs. The toxin on the blade, the very same poison he had used to slaughter Ronan's family, flooded the Alpha's system. The colossal wolf convulsed violently, his red eyes rolling back into his head, before he collapsed onto the blood-soaked floorboards in a massive, twitching heap. Alpha Garrick was dead. The remaining 4 elite guards, witnessing the impossible, their invincible Alpha slaughtered by a single warrior who was immune to his command, broke entirely. They dropped their heavy broadswords and scrambled backward off the porch, fleeing in absolute terror into the dark, suffocating depths of the Blackwood. They would not survive the night. Without Garrick's blood tie to anchor them, the forest would close in, and the true shadows of the woods would claim them before they ever reached the borders. The cabin fell silent, save for the crackling of the fire in the hearth and the heavy, ragged sound of Ronan's breathing. The executioner stood perfectly still amidst the absolute carnage of his former pack. He looked down at the massive, dead form of the tyrant who had stolen 5 years of his life. The blinding, apocalyptic rage that had fueled him slowly began to recede, leaving behind a profound, crystal-clear sense of peace. The debt was paid. His family was avenged. Ronan pulled a clean scrap of cloth from his belt and methodically wiped the silver-forged dagger clean. He sheathed the weapon back into his boot. He turned around. Sable was sitting up on the woven pallet, the heavy wool blanket clutched tightly around her shoulders. Her moss-green eyes were wide with mesmerizing awe. She looked at the blood splattered across his armor, at the bodies littering her floor, and finally, up into the dark, profound depths of the warrior's eyes. He had not just spared her. He had annihilated an entire strike team and slaughtered an Alpha to protect her sanctuary. Ronan walked slowly across the room, carefully stepping over the debris of the shattered door. He stopped directly in front of the pallet. He did not stand over her like an executioner. The massive, lethal god of war slowly lowered his huge frame, dropping to both knees on the wooden floorboards before the exhausted forest witch. He reached out, his calloused, blood-stained hands gently taking her pale, trembling fingers. He bowed his head, pressing his forehead against the knuckles of the woman who had saved his life one meal at a time. "The pack is dead to me," Ronan whispered, his voice a fierce, unbreakable vow that resonated with the magic of the ancient trees outside. He looked up, his eyes shining with absolute devotion. "I came into this grove a broken weapon, looking for a monster. But I found the only light left in this world. My blade is yours, Sable. My breath is yours. As long as I draw breath, no shadow, no wolf, and no army will ever touch this cabin again." Sable's eyes filled with tears. She gently pulled her hand free, reaching out to cup his rugged, unscarred face. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his, her ancient magic weaving seamlessly with his restored heartbeat. The heavy, oppressive gloom of the Blackwood seemed to instantly lift, the trees outside shifting to let the first pure, unbroken light of dawn filter down into the clearing. But what do you think? Would you be able to drop your blade and forgive your target if your worst enemy started healing your deepest scars? Did Alpha Garrick get the brutal, ironic karma he truly deserved for using a grieving husband as a weapon? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love this epic tale of dark magic, betrayal, and a fierce, protective warrior falling for the misunderstood which he was sent to kill, please smash that like button and share this video with your fellow fantasy romance fans. And if you want to find out how Ronan and Sable cleanse the rest of the Blackwood together, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next epic tale.